I want to speak today about a far more sensitive subject, and it is in fact sensitive to many atheists, and that's the illusion of free will. And I want to talk about this because the illusoriness of free will is as certain a fact as the truth of evolution, in my mind. And unlike evolution, understanding this truth about the human mind has the potential to change our sense of moral goodness and what it would mean to create a just society. The question of free will touches nearly everything people care about: religion, public policy, politics, the legal system, feelings of personal accomplishment, emotions like guilt and pride and remorse. So much of human life seems to depend on our viewing one another as conscious agents capable of free choice. So if the scientific community were ever to declare free will an illusion, as I think we eventually must, I think it would precipitate a culture war far more acrimonious than the one that has been waged on the subject of evolution. Now, I hope to do two things in this talk. I hope to convince you that free will is an illusion. And so I hope to take up the challenge that Dinesh laid down in the debate. And it's worse than an illusion. It's actually a totally incoherent idea, which is to say it's impossible to describe a universe in which it could be true. Not only is it untrue, it's hard to make sense of what's even being claimed to be true. And I also hope to convince you that understanding this truth about the human mind actually matters, and that it can change the way we view morality and questions of justice. Now, the popular conception of free will seems to rest on two assumptions. The first is that each of us was free to behave differently than we did in the past. You became a fireman, and yet you could have become a policeman. You chose chocolate, but you could have chosen vanilla. It certainly seems like this is the world we're living in. Now, the second assumption is that we are the conscious source of our thoughts and actions. And so that your experience of wanting to do something is in fact the proximate cause of your doing that something. You feel that you want to move, and then you move. Okay, you are doing it. You, the conscious witness of your life. Now, unfortunately, we know that both of these assumptions are just untrue. The first problem is that we live in a world of cause and effect, and there's no way of thinking about cause and effect that allows us to say that the buck stops here. Okay? The buck never stops. Okay? Either our wills are determined by prior causes, a long chain of prior causes, and we're not responsible for them, or they're the product of chance, and we're not responsible for them, or there's some combination of chance and determinism. But no combination seems to give you the free will that people cherish. Now, you could consider a generic serial killer. Okay, his choice to commit his last murder was determined by neurophysiological events in his brain, which were in turn determined by prior causes. Bad genes, the developmental effects of an unhappy childhood, a night of lost sleep because a car alarm was going off down the street. Okay, these events precede any conscious decision to act. So what does it mean to say that this murderer committed his crime of his own free will? Okay, if this statement means anything, it must mean that he could have behaved differently. He could have resisted the impulse to commit the murder, or he could have declined to feel the impulse altogether. And not on the basis of some random influences over which he had no conscious control, but because he was actually the conscious author of his thoughts and actions. Now, the problem is no one has been able to describe a way in which mental and physical events could arise that would make sense of this claim of freedom. Now, when we assume that violent criminals have such freedom, of course, we reflexively blame them for their actions. But when we look at this wider net of causality, the basis for placing blame seems to evaporate. The moment we catch sight of a stream of causes that reach back into childhood and beyond, the sense of his culpability begins to disappear. And to say that he would have done otherwise, or could have done otherwise, had he chosen to, is simply to say he would have lived in a different universe had he been in a different universe. Now, as sickening as I might find such a person's behavior, I have to admit that if I were to trade places with him, atom for atom, I would be him. There's no extra part of me that could resist the impulse to victimize innocent people. And even if you believe that every one of us harbors an immortal soul, this problem of responsibility remains. I cannot take credit for the fact that I don't have the soul of a psychopath. So if I had truly been in this person's shoes, if I had his genes and life experience and an identical brain or an identical soul in an identical state, I would have behaved as he did, and for the same reasons. That nobody picks their parents or the society into which they were born. Nobody picks the life influences that shape the development of their nervous system. You are no more responsible for the microstructure of your brain at this moment than you are for your height. So the role of luck in our lives appears decisive. One has to be very unlucky to have the mind and brain of a psychopath. Now, but the significance of luck is very difficult to admit because it seems to totally destabilize our sense of morality. And yet, in specific circumstances, it's very easy to admit. So if you imagine this murderer was discovered to have a brain tumor in the appropriate spot in his brain that would explain his violent impulses, well, then that is obviously exculpatory. Then he's just a victim, or we view him as a victim of biology. And our moral intuitions shift automatically. But I would argue that a brain tumor is just a special case of physical events giving rise to thoughts and actions. Okay, and if we fully understood the neurophysiology of any murderer's brain, that would be as exculpatory as finding a tumor in it. If we could see how the wrong genes were being relentlessly transcribed, if we could see how this person's genome and entanglement with other people and ideas and events throughout life had sculpted the microstructure of his brain so that it was guaranteed to produce violent states of mind and violent behavior, the basis for placing blame, in the sense that we usually do, would disappear. Now, of course, this is a problem that scientists and philosophers are well aware of, and many people think they have arguments that allow us to keep free will in play, even in light of these facts. And I'll talk about some of those. But I want to suggest to you that the problem of free will is actually deeper than this, is deeper than the problem of cause and effect. And most people think that we have, the problem is we have a subjective experience of free will, but it can't be mapped onto physical reality. I'm about to argue that free will doesn't even correspond to any subjective fact about us. And if you pay attention to your experience closely, you can notice this. If you pay attention, you can see that you no more decide the next thing you think than the next thing I say. Thoughts simply appear in consciousness. Very much like my words. What are you going to think next? So what am I going to say next? I could suddenly start talking about the pleasures of snowshoeing. Where did that come from? From your point of view, it came out of nowhere. But the same thing is happening in the privacy of your own mind. You've all made an effort to be here and to stay this extra hour to hear, presumably to hear what I have to say about free will. But there's also a voice in your head that is just saying things. Haven't you noticed? Okay, and many of these things have nothing to do with what I'm talking about. You're struggling to follow my train of thought, but there's competition. Okay, you suddenly start thinking things like, I should probably stop drinking diet soda. Right? Thoughts just emerge in consciousness. We are not authoring them. That would require that we think them before we think them. If you can't control your next thought, and you don't know what it's going to be until it arises, where is your freedom of will?